Commonly referred to as the best place to live in the world, Canada is a land of promise. When you think of Canada, you typically think of a nation full of economic prosperity, a nation built on the backs of individual freedom, a nation full of magnificent natural wonders. However, the Canada we know and love today is built on an unfortunate truth. For thousands of years, Indigenous people have called Canada their home, using this sacred land to live prosperous lives. However, this all changed in the late 15th century when British expeditions colonized these lands. In the process of colonization, Indigenous individuals were forcibly stripped of their basic rights, culture, and resources. And unsurprisingly, over time, this continued disregard for Indigenous people has led to a crisis.
In reported suicide.
It is no surprise today that Indigenous communities are dealing with a massive generational trauma issue that is leading to what experts are calling a suicide crisis. In Canada, the typical suicide rate for non-Indigenous individuals is 8 per every 100,000. However, this jumps to over 24 deaths per year for Indigenous peoples. Let that sink in. Indigenous individuals are 3 times more likely to take their own lives. But what's causing this? Well, unlike many other people in Canada, Indigenous communities face massive inequalities in not having access to the same resources like water, healthcare, and education. These resource inequalities force the Indigenous people to suffer through extremely difficult living conditions that over time create a cycle of generational trauma that eventually manifests in the suicide crisis we are facing today.
When exploring the underlying issues for the high suicide rates for Indigenous people, one of the key factors is the lack of clean water. The Ojibwe phrase Nibi Onje Bima Diziwin, or water is life, has become a rallying cry for Indigenous environmental justice worldwide. Canada possesses the world's 3rd largest freshwater reserves, with 9% of Canada's surface area being covered by fresh water. Despite this, 618 First Nations communities are still not supplied with safe drinking water. The lack of clean water that Indigenous groups in Canada experience since birth leads to poor health at a young age. And due to this, Indigenous people will experience trauma starting from a young age. Moreover, in their article Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang conducts research that indicates that First Nations communities with limited access to safe drinking water connects with disproportionately high suicide rates. Where water violations occur, sickness and death are not far. This article presents compelling evidence surrounding the link between water's insecurity and suicide in the First Nations in Ontario, illustrating that water is life is not only a metaphor, but is a struggle for life itself. Therefore, due to the lack of access to clean water, Indigenous people struggle with childhood trauma from poor health, which leads to an increased rate of suicide in the Indigenous community.
However, water isn't the only lacking resource that contributes to the staggeringly high suicide rate. Healthcare stands as another critical one. According to Statistics Canada, significantly higher proportions of First Nations people reported being without a regular healthcare provider compared with non-Indigenous individuals. In fact, 56.5% of Inuit actually reported not having access to a healthcare provider, and many Indigenous individuals also reported having to wait 2 weeks to see their doctor or other healthcare provider. Indigenous individuals also have less access to mental health resources, and since Indigenous people face poorer reported physical and mental health, a higher prevalence of chronic conditions, and disabilities compared to non-Indigenous individuals, having access to adequate healthcare should be a necessity. Also, according to the Government of Canada, Indigenous people face multiple barriers in accessing adequate mental health and substance use care, primarily due to systematic racism. All this combined plays a big part to the suicide crisis. When Indigenous people find the strength to seek support, that support is not available, and when they need help, they're unable to get it, leading to worse problems. However, there is yet another resource that many Indigenous people lack that contributes to the high suicide rate. This is the lack of education.
As students here at the University of Waterloo, no matter where we may be from, we have all been going to school since we were 5 years old, and maybe even younger. School is a norm for us, but for thousands of Indigenous children and teens, this basic right is not available to them at all. In fact, according to the Center of Preventing Suicide, the fact that this many Indigenous people have limited access to education and employment, and therefore a higher instance of poverty, actually leads to them having more experiences of trauma. Not only this, but most reserves don't even have high schools, so the kids are required to go very far to a school that they are all treated as outsiders in, again leading to a traumatic experience. For the schools on the reserve, they are terribly underfunded, and don't even have basic amenities, such as counseling services for the trauma that they faced, or access to a water or cafeteria, amenities that we are all afforded. Due to this, over half of the Indigenous population living in Ontario reserves do not hold a high school degree, compared to the 91% of the Ontario population, making it very difficult for them to find any employment at all. Try to picture that. Going so far to school every day where you're discriminated against, all to likely not even gain a degree and thus not find employment. This itself leads to a future of so many people having to live in poverty, which causes their mental health to deteriorate, leading so many of them to take their lives. This exact reason is why the issue of lack of education must be addressed in Canada.
We've seen how a lack of basic resources force Indigenous individuals into extremely traumatic situations. However, this is not an unsolvable problem. Individuals like yourself have an incredible opportunity to help provide communities with the resources they need, to break the cycle of generational trauma and provide relief from the suicide crisis. If you're passionate about supporting, you can donate to the Gord Downey Fund by scanning the QR code, where your donation will directly go to giving Indigenous communities the resources they need to thrive.